Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Neeru Tandon from Department of English, VSSD College, Kanpur. We are discussing paper 3rd, 19th century English literature. In this, the present module discusses Elizabeth Gaskell's Wives and Daughter. Before understanding this, let us understand the Victorian period first. Victorian period is an age of democracy, an age of popular education, an age of religious tolerance, an age of growing brotherhood, and an age of profound social unrest, yet comparative peace and rapid progress in all the arts and sciences, and also in mechanical inventions. Now, Lady Gaskell, she was the daughter of a Unitarian clergyman who was a civil servant and journalist. Elizabeth Gaskell, who belongs to Victorian age, inherited something from the age, but she was unique as a writer, and through her novels she wanted to say something, to convey to society, to change the society and purge the society of its ills. Gaskell was brought up after her mother's death by her aunt in Knutsford, a small village that served as the prototype not only for Cranford but also for Hollingford in Wives and Daughters. And the setting of the numerous short stories and novellas also we find that it is there. Gaskell's early fame as a social novelist began with the 1848 publication of Mary Barton, A Tale of Manchester's Life, in which she pricks the conscience of industrial England through a depiction and analysis of the working class. To introduce her, her complete name was Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell. She was novelist as well as journalist. She was born on 29th September 1810, Chalasa, London, England. She died on 12th November 1865, Hollybourne, Hampshire, England. Her parents, William Stevenson, a Unitarian minister, and the mother was Elizabeth Stevenson. She married William Gaskell, who was a Unitarian minister. Elizabeth was also distantly related to the scientist Charles Darwin. She even met the poet William Wordsworth in the Lake District. A keen traveller, Elizabeth visited Italy, Germany, and France with her daughters. Her husband William, who preferred trips in Britain, sometimes stayed in the Lake District. Many critics were hostile to the novel Wives and Daughters because of its open sympathy for the workers in their relations with their masters. But the high quality of writing and characterization are undeniable. And critics have compared Mary Barton to the work of Frederick Engels and other contemporaries in terms of its accuracy in social observation. Then the later publication of North and South, another novel by the novelist, also deals with the relationship of workers and masters, strengthened Lady Gaskell's status as a leader in social fiction. The novelist Elizabeth Cleghorn Gaskell is now best known as the author of Cranford, North and South, and as the biographer of her friend Charlotte Brontë. Her greatest books were written in reaction to the industrialization of Manchester, where she lived for much of her life. Gaskell, she left behind a rich literary legacy, including 6 novels, several short stories, and non-fictional pieces. She also wrote biography of Charlotte Brontë, and it was the first biography of Miss Brontë. Her novels are cherished for their vivid characters and arresting portrayals of Victorian life. Gaskell was a vibrant new voice to the genre of industrial fiction. She is a Victorian author, no doubt. She is biographer of a great repute. She is humanitarian. She is social campaigner. She was successful as a wife, as mother. So Elizabeth Gaskell's books explore timeless themes of human dignity, suffering and hope. Now there are two controversies attached with the life of Elizabeth Gaskell. In 1853, she shocked the literary world and offended many readers with the publication of her novel Ruth. This novel was an exploration of seduction and illegitimacy. The second controversy arose following the 1857 publication of her biography, The Life of Charlotte Bronte. The biography's initial wave of praise was quickly followed by protests. Gaskell, who died in 1865, leaving her final novel, Wives and Daughters, incomplete. We are discussing this very novel which could not be completed by her. Now this novel had a subtitle. The subtitle was An Everyday Story. What she wanted by giving this subtitle? She wanted that wives and daughters, it's a common universal phenomena. And when their problems are problems of everyone, their problems are not the problems of a day. So that's why she has given this subtitle, An Everyday Story. It was first published in the Cornhill magazine as a serial from August 1864 to January 1866. It was originally published in August 1864. It was adapted for certain films also. Editor was Pam Morris. Characters: Molly Gibson, Cynthia, Kirkpatrick, Mr. Preston, Mr. Gibson, Mrs. Hyacinth and Kirkpatrick. The subtitle of this novel was given by her, and while Mrs. Morris goes a long way to dispute the accuracy of this label, relating it not only to fairy tale and feminism but also to Darwinism. This Victorian novel is a story of Miss Molly Gibson, the major character, who at the age of 17 gets not only a new stepmother but also a very beautiful stepsister. The novel follows Molly throughout the next couple of years. She adjusted to the new circumstances of her life, and she also adjusted to many circumstances that came in her way, good or bad. Now let us see story chronologically at a glance. When Molly was a small child, her mother died. Molly's father, Mr. Gibson, marries a widow woman with a daughter about Molly's age named Cynthia. Cynthia is beautiful and charming, and she and Molly became fast friends. Molly loved Cynthia and would do anything for her. Before Molly's father married, Molly has become friends with Hamley's family in the neighborhood. The Hamleys have two sons, Osborne and Roger. Molly and Roger became friends, and Roger talks to Molly about books and science and teaches her things she always wanted to learn. Osborne has secretly got married and wanted her to help keep his secret from his father. While Roger is away in Africa, Molly finds out her sister is already engaged to another man. Molly previously thought that her sister loved Roger, so she wanted to remain away from Roger for the sake of her sister. Then Molly helped her sister at the risk of her own reputation. Cynthia calls off the engagement the day before Osborne Hamley dies. And when Roger comes to town to take care of the funeral business, he realizes the love he was looking for was growing right in front of him all along in the shape of Molly and not Cynthia. Now let us discuss these major characters of the novel to understand this novel in a better way. The first and foremost important character is the heroine of the novel, Molly Gibson. She is smart and well educated. 17 years old Molly Gibson lives a happy life with her father, only marred by the death of her mother. She is not as obviously beautiful as her stepsister, but she is very pretty and everyone loves her. She loves her father very much and was not at all happy when he got married for the second time. Molly has disregarded the commonest rules of modesty and propriety. Molly is treated as a pariah. We are sure that Molly loves Roger. She would have been willing to cut off her right hand if need were to forward his attachment to Cynthia, and the sacrifice would have added a strange jest to a happy crisis. This was written by the novelist to present that how much Molly loved Cynthia. Molly becomes a foundation of strength and hope to her elders as well as her peers. When Mrs. Osborne Hamley falls ill, Molly is again the provider of strength and comfort. Mr. Gibson loves Molly very much. Now, let us talk about Mr. Gibson. In Molly's eyes, he is the wisest judge and a person to be trusted and relied upon in all situations. As a doctor, Mr. Gibson is a caring and honest man. He is educated and respectful. Mr. Gibson remarries so that Molly will have a mother again, and he will have a wife to promote domestic harmony. Mr. Gibson has noticed his wife's shortcomings as well, but he puts on a brave face and attempts to ignore them as much as possible. Mrs. Gibson or Mrs. KIRKPATRICK. She is a pretentious but poor widow. She eagerly accepts Mr. Gibson's offer. She instantly sets about improving his house, his diet, his daughter, and intriguingly putting off the return of her own daughter, Cynthia. When Mrs. KIRKPATRICK becomes Mrs. Gibson, she professes to love Molly as if she were her own daughter, and to have her interest at heart at all times. However, in the picture of Mrs. Gibson, which Gaskell paints so clearly, what she says and what she does are two completely different things. Though Mrs. Gibson speaks as though her greatest pleasure is to know that the people she cares for are comfortable, in reality, she cares mostly for her own personal comfort. Cynthia again becomes a very important character because of the Molly's love for her. She is a nuisance to her widowed mother. Cynthia was sent away to school in France at a young age. Much more independent than Molly, she calls herself a moral kangaroo. She finds herself entangled in an unwanted engagement to Mr. Preston, a local land agent. Unable to free herself from the situation of deceit and shame in which she finds herself, Cynthia enlists the help of innocent Molly to retrieve her love letters. Cynthia is beautiful, Cynthia is captivating, Cynthia is spirited and somewhat mysterious too. But Cynthia adores and admires Molly, conscious of her own flaws and Molly's moral superiority. She loved Molly. She wanted that Molly should also remain happy. Molly is thoughtful and considerate, guided by intelligence and good judgment, where Cynthia is selfish and thoughtless. She is eager to jump ahead without considering the consequences, to run away when complications ensue. So that is a great contrast between Molly and Cynthia. Another character comes in front of us in the shape of Squire Hamley. He lost his beloved wife and his son Osborne. He is very emotional. He speaks about what he feels, and that too loudly. Squire Hamley must be the antidote to such stoics, yet he manages to be emotional and sympathetic without being emasculated. He has an overwhelming personality and can be selfish in his desires and expectations. But even then, he remains one of the most vivid and a lifelike character. Mr. Osborne, son of Hamley, he was never in harmony with his father Hamley. Osborne Hamley's failures make his invalid mother's illness worse and widens the divide between him and his father. The considerable debts Osborne has run up in maintaining his secret wife are there. Mrs. Hamley dies, and the breach between the squire and his eldest son seems irreparable. He also dies, leaving his wife and 2-year-old son. The next character, Mr. Roger, is the son of Mr. Hamley. Roger is an avid naturalist, enchanted by the natural world around him, and Molly to some extent catches his enthusiasm. Molly, however, has always preferred Roger's good sense and honourable character and soon falls in love with him. Unfortunately, Roger falls in love with Cynthia, and when Mrs. Gibson overhears that Osborne may be fatally ill, she begins promoting the match. Just before Roger leaves on a 2-year scientific expedition to Africa, he asks for Cynthia's hand, which she accepts, although she insists that the engagement should remain secret until and unless he returns. Molly, who loved Roger, is heartbroken and struggles with her sorrow and her knowledge that Cynthia lacks affection for Roger. Roger Hamley had written an article that had just been published in a scientific periodical, and Lord Hollingford had requested that he come for dinner at the Towers with them. Squire Hamley was in one of his moods when he heard of the invitation and was very upset about him going, so Roger declined the invitation. This shows that Roger is considerate. This shows that Roger could understand the love of his life. It proves that he is compassionate also. The end of the novel is noteworthy. Molly Gibson is getting ready for the gala, an annual festival given by the Lord and Lady Cumnor. She is to be picked up with the Browning sisters and taken to the Towers. Roger begins to realize that his affection for Molly is more than that of a brother for a sister, aided by the kind interference of Lady Harriet, who has always recognized Molly's worth and charms. Roger is thwarted, this time by a scarlet fever scare, in his attempt to speak to Molly before he leaves. At this point, Gaskell's novel stops, unfinished at her death. She related to a friend that she had intended Roger to return and present Molly with a dried flower, a gift Molly gave him before his departure, as proof of his enduring love. Now, Roger and Molly are married, and if one of them is happier than the other, it is Molly. Her husband has no need to draw upon the little fortune which is to go to poor Osborne's boy, for he becomes professor at some grey scientific institution and wins his way in the world handsomely. The squire is almost as happy in this marriage as his son. If anyone suffers for it, it is Mr. Gibson. Cheese is only fit for the kitchen. That is a sentence that you find so many times in the novel Wives and Daughters by Gaskell. Food and wine is there to be discussed by many, and specifically cheese. There is something related with the cheese that it was considered as a cheap food in Victorian age, and Gaskell has represented that through this novel. Just for an incident to be quoted, when being questioned about her father's likes and dislikes by her stepmother, Molly Gibson reveals that her father doesn't care what he has if it is only ready. He would take bread and cheese if cook would only send it in instead of dinner. Thus, cheese, for example, is not just food but a symbol of vulgarity, because we must change all that. I shouldn't like to think of your father eating cheese. It is such a strong smelling coarse kind of thing. Cheese is only fit for the kitchen, said by her stepmother. That shows that cheese as a thing is discussed by Elizabeth Gaskell just to present that such things were not welcomed in the society. Elizabeth Gaskell also said, "I know you despise me. Allow me to say it is because you don't understand me." Now this shows the confidence of the novelist in the Victorian age, the age where women were fit for procreation or for marriage. In such a scene, in such an atmosphere, holding her right, holding her feminism upright was a task for her. Elizabeth Gaskell was a woman ahead of her times. Her writing won the admiration of people like Charles Dickens, Charlotte Bronte, Charles Eliot Norton, and Harriet Beecher Stowe, among others. Like modern professionals, Gaskell and her husband often lived separate lives. They did so in order to accommodate their own vocations. However, both were supportive and involved in the other's career. Now, when she died in 1865, there was something strange that she bought a house for herself and it was not known to her husband. When she died in that particular home, her husband was startled not only to find her dead, but also that she bought a home without his knowledge. She was loved by many, and Charles Dickens called her his dear Scheherazade. Scheherazade is a legendary queen and the storyteller of 1001 Nights. So, let me present to sum up the 5 interesting facts about this Victorian career woman. First of all, she was the sole surviving child from her parents' union, and the importance she got was there and she exercised it in her authority. Charles Dickens had great expectations for her and encouraged her to write more and more. She has influential friends like Florence Nightingale and Charlotte Bronte. She wrote about tough stuff. What do I mean by tough stuff is the topics that were not very much welcomed. Gaskell's novel Ruth was controversial. She wouldn't even allow her own daughters to read it. This novel Ruth explores themes of poverty, sexual exploitation, illegitimacy, and the lack of morality in the practice of social ostracism. Elizabeth Gaskell's husband, William Gaskell, who was a Unitarian minister, he also burned copies of Ruth. Another thing, that she bought a house without her husband's knowledge and died there, it shows that she had the power to present her individualism. She had the power to show that being a female in the Victorian society is not a crime. She encouraged others also to come forward and prove themselves, prove their mettle in the form of woman. So, enjoy this novel and thanks for visiting EPG Pathshala.